Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a really fascinating mission. We're going to dive deep into a potential blueprint for, well, a globally relevant education system. And it's one rooted in the cultural and, importantly, the spiritual foundations of India.
Yeah, the sources we're looking at today, they paint this really ambitious picture. They frame India, not just in the past, but right now, as a place built on high moral ideals and highly talented individuals.
You've got quite a mix here: history, philosophy, and even some very specific policy ideas like something called PROUT, the progressive utilization theory.
Exactly. And our aim isn't just to, list facts. It's more about pulling out those key insights, the nuggets that show how these sort of ancient spiritual ideas could actually translate into practical, future-focused policy. What strikes me is the optimism, really. The whole mission seems geared towards creating this forward-thinking, holistic education model, one that's aimed squarely at building world citizens.
And the sources get straight to the point about what's at stake. They argue that these traditions, the spiritual and cultural ones, historically upheld by things like the Gurukul system, well, they're the backbone of the country. They ensure qualities like dignity, values, patriotism, and self-respect. So to really grasp that, we first need to untangle two words people often mix up: culture and civilization.
Absolutely. It's crucial to separate the intellectual side from the material side. The sources define culture pretty simply. It's the collective name for how we express basic life, how we eat, laugh, show hospitality, even how we grieve. And importantly, they argue that human culture, deep down, is one single thing, a kind of unified intellectual experience. Even if the local ways of doing things look different, like, say, eating with your hands versus using a fork.
Okay, let's dig into that distinction a bit because it feels really important for figuring out priorities, especially in policy moving forward. If culture is that basic expression, what actually makes a society civilized?
Right.
So civilization, in this view, is refined culture. It's the sum total of customs, conduct, courtesy, ideals, love, affection, all those things woven together. The sources draw a very clear line here. Culture is the intellectual level of expression, while civilization is more about the material dimension of life.
Okay, so culture is like the inner foundation, the mind, the morality, and civilization is the outer structure, how society visibly operates. This immediately brings up a question about, well, the modern world, where it often feels like material progress is racing ahead of wisdom or ethical development.
That's precisely the warning flag the sources raise. They stress that you can't have true, sustainable civilization without that matching intellectual development, without that elevated culture. If we just chase material advancement, we might look civilized, with all the tech and wealth. But the sources warn that without the mental and moral growth, you actually see degradation. They specifically mention things like obscene literature or nude art as examples where there's maybe a material focus, but not that corresponding intellectual or moral upliftment. For a truly progressive future, the idea is that the culture has to lead the material, the civilization.
That philosophy then directly leads to needing non-material ideals built right into the education system. The sources are pretty firm on this. Education does not contain spirituality as incomplete, but how they define spirituality so it doesn't just become, religious dogma.
They root it in something very practical: morality. They state clearly that the basis of practical spirituality is morality. So it's not about abstract doctrines as much as it is about developing an internal moral compass that guides how you learn and behave. And this blending of morality and learning is seen as absolutely essential, woven into the fabric of the Indian educational approach.
That makes a lot of sense. If spirituality means morality and high ideals, it becomes a universal tool for thinking, not something sectarian. And speaking of integrated tools, there's this fascinating little detail in the sources about language itself, linking it directly to spiritual concepts.
Yes, that's quite something. It shows how deeply integrated the thinking is. They break language expression down into 6 stages. Now, the 6th stage, Shruti Gochara, that's audible speech, what we're using now. But there are 5 stages before that: Panansi, Madhyama, Yotamana, and Vaikari. These are described as non-distinct internal stages, and they actually correlate them to the chakra system, moving all the way up from the base chakra, the Muladhara, to the vocal cords.
For listeners maybe not familiar, the chakras are often described as centers of psychic energy or consciousness. So they're not just saying language is important. They're suggesting our ability to think and speak is physically and spiritually tied to the deepest levels of our being.
Exactly. It underlines this whole idea of a holistic system where mind, spirit, and expression are fundamentally linked. And that brings us neatly to the core life principle that supported this classical system: pratadharma.
Pratadharma. That sounds significant.
It really is. It's defined as the natural social characteristics that make a group distinct. For the Indian context discussed here, this life essence, this prapatharma, was channeled towards one main goal: to foster a Brahmic sentiment in every action, thought, and expression. Essentially, it means living life introspectively, seeing every single thought, every task as a form of spiritual practice, a constant inward focus.
Wow. And the way they sustained that intense focus wasn't like our universities today, was it? It was the Gurukul system. That sounds less like just school and more like a complete integrated life commitment.
Absolutely. It was structured across the entire lifespan. First stage, ages 5 to 25, you lived a disciplined life in the Gurugo. The focus was double: learn higher, spiritual knowledge, and practical worldly knowledge. But just as important was cultivating conduct, being reverent, humble, noble.
But the learning didn't just stop when you, say, got a job or started a family, which is often how we think about education ending.
No, and that's perhaps the most radical aspect. Between 25 and 50, while living as a householder, working, raising a family, you were still expected to actively discuss and acquire spiritual knowledge. And then, after 50, in this stage called vanaprastha, the expectation shifted again. You were to engage only in higher knowledge. It's really a blueprint for continuous intellectual and moral growth throughout life.
That underlying strength, that deeply embedded dharma, that really sets the stage for understanding the historical challenge the sources bring up next.
Yes, it does. The 1835 statement attributed to Lord Macaulay, reporting back to the British Parliament. His observation is almost startling to read today. He apparently reported traveling across India and finding not a single beggar or thief, and noting immense wealth, such high moral standards, and such talented people.
So he basically saw that their material well-being was directly protected by this strong intellectual and moral backbone.
Precisely. And his conclusion was chillingly strategic: that conquering India would be impossible unless that backbone was deliberately broken. The proposed method was quite surgical: dismantle their education system and actively promote the idea that anything foreign is superior to anything indigenous. He understood that if you shatter cultural confidence, you break morale and pave the way for control.
The way the sources present that story, though, isn't just about lamenting the past. It powerfully highlights how effective that original spirituality-infused education must have been. It's used almost as a benchmark, saying, look how strong this was. This is the kind of resilience we need to rebuild and modernize. If that foundation was the target, then the future needs a robust policy framework to protect it.
Yes. And if you think about the modern world, a different kind of challenge arises: complexity, information overload. That broken backbone could also manifest as just being intellectually overwhelmed, which, interestingly, brings us to language policy.
Yes. The sources point out a real problem. How sometimes, well-meaning political enthusiasm, especially in nation building, can saddle students with way too many mandatory languages.
They give a specific example. A Sindhi-speaking student, maybe in Pakistan, potentially juggling 5 languages: mother tongue, English, a religious language, the national language, maybe another for job prospects. And the crucial question becomes, is that student truly getting liberated through education, or just mentally exhausted trying to keep up with all the different grammars?
Right. So the progressive solution offered is actually simplification.
Yeah.
Cut back the mandatory languages to just the essentials, the mother tongue and one designated world language, which for now is English.
Exactly. The argument is, if a child develops a genuine thirst for knowledge using those two, they'll naturally pick up other languages later if they need or want to. English is acknowledged as the current global key to the temple of knowledge. But, and this shows that futuristic perspective, the sources also say, look, English isn't fixed forever. Far down the line, maybe another language will be better suited to the needs of that age. So the policy needs built-in flexibility.
And that leads us right into the specific blueprint for that kind of structure. The PROUT framework, Progressive Utilization Theory, which offers a clear 3-language policy.
That's it. So Pillar 1, mother tongue, your natural language. That's for intellectual comfort, cultural grounding. Pillar 2, basic Sanskrit or another suitable classical language.
Okay, wait. Mandating a classical language like Sanskrit in a futuristic plan, wouldn't that potentially slow things down, maybe hinder access to modern science? That seems like a potential burden.
It's a very fair point. The justification given in the sources is that learning a classical language helps you understand the deep history and structure of your own mother tongue. It provides a kind of cultural anchor. Then Pillar 3 is the world language, currently English, which is framed specifically as the tool to help students think of themselves as world citizens. So it's trying to balance, root them historically and culturally, but also equip them for global interaction.
And practically speaking, the framework stresses that for everyday life, government, offices, courts, the mother tongue should be the default to keep things efficient and accessible.
Absolutely. The aim is to encourage voluntary language learning while keeping the compulsory part rational and philosophically sound. This all feeds into the broader PROUT education policy, which even defines education itself using that powerful maxim, Savidyaya Vimuktaya education is that which liberates.
That really does set a high standard. Let's quickly summarize the main pillars of that PROU policy, because this seems to be the structure designed to actually implement those ancient ideals we talked about earlier.
Okay, the 4 key pillars are accessibility, content, governance, and outcome. Accessibility is pretty straightforward but crucial. Education must be equal, free, compulsory, and accessible to everyone. Content is where the integration happens. Modern education absolutely needs to be infused with those core moral and spiritual values.
And the governance part sounds quite forward-thinking. It says management should be with educators themselves, allowing parental input, but keeping authority with the learning professionals. With society and government sharing the overall responsibility, it sort of decentralizes the power over teaching.
It does. And finally, the outcome focus. This is all geared towards creating genuinely capable global citizens. Desired outcomes include practical things like employment-oriented skills, but also developing a global outlook, neo-humanist thinking, making learning joyful. And here's the synthesis: integrated personality development, physical, mental, and spiritual. This is really bringing it all together, that disciplined intellectual life focus of Pradharma, but delivered through a modern, structured, and liberating policy framework.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From those high ideals and the incredibly comprehensive Gurukul life learning system, through the historical attempts to undermine it, and arriving at this detailed, future-focused PROU policy that really champions integrated development, spiritual, mental, physical, aiming to create truly global citizens.
I think the core optimistic takeaway here is that this kind of synthesis is presented as totally achievable. You take the high standards of the culture and give them a practical, refined shape through the civilization, the PRU framework. That's presented as the way to ensure lasting dignity, relevance on a global scale, and, well, keeping that national backbone strong for the future.
It really makes you pause and think about what progress actually means, doesn't it? Separating, just getting more stuff from genuine intellectual and moral refinement. And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listener. If the real measure of civilization is this intellectual and moral development, more so than just material gain, what's one single area in your own learning or perhaps your work that you could consciously infuse with a bit more moral or spiritual purpose this week? How could you make your own knowledge truly liberating? Something to think about as you build your own integrated, progressive future.